Hi, I'm Leah DiCicco-Ramu. Welcome. This is Teacher Talk. Hi, everyone. This is episode 6 of How to Talk to Teachers, Teacher Talk, a series of webcasts and podcasts where I bring in some forward-thinking education leaders to help parents navigate school systems and advocate for their children in partnership with educators. Our topics have included things that are top of mind for parents, including well-being and technology. Today, we're going to dive into a juicy one, assessment. That's right, your child's grades and the quest for straight A's. We're going to break it down into the assessment practice into 3 parts to help parents have better discussions with teachers about their child's learning. And let me put a pin in this here because we're not going to translate that into a mark. We're going to look at what learning actually is and how assessment practice can affect learning or not. So we have with us today one of the most insightful, thoughtful, and intelligent education thought leaders I've ever met in my career. And I've had a long career in this space for those of you who know me. It's Mr. Christopher Federico, and he's the head of school at the Roeper School in Detroit. Christopher, who goes by he, him, has been an educator and an educational leader in both public and independent schools with a particular focus on teaching gifted students for over 25 years. Now, hold on to your bootstraps, everybody, because he's got so many accolades and so much experience. I'm going to run through his bio because when I read it, and I've known Christopher for a while, I was totally wowed. So here we go. So he comes to Roeper, or he's at Roeper from Toronto, Canada, having previously served as the head of academics and head of upper school at Bayview Glen, which is an independent pre-K to 12 school of approximately 1,200 students, and as director of curriculum, research, and the university partnerships at the University of Toronto Schools, another independent day school in Toronto, for achieving students in grades from grade 7 to 12. He's especially interested in leading and supporting innovative teaching and learning and works with students and educators at all levels, so from kindergarten to graduate studies, to explore wicked problems, to develop skills and inquiry. And I've had so many conversations with him, and I love that he's able to really get me thinking and thinking critically and thinking deeply about things we're both very passionate about. So he's a fellow at the I Think initiative at the Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, and has worked with the Learning Partnership, a national not-for-profit organization to lead innovation in Canada's publicly funded schools. He's also taught at the post-secondary level, including as an instructor in the Master's Teaching Program at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, so OISE. He's a member of the Ontario College of Teachers and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Trinity College, U of T, a Bachelor of Education from the Faculty of Education, University of Toronto, and a Master's of Arts from the Royal Military College of Canada. This is where it gets really interesting. A graduate certificate in public administration and leadership from Toronto Metro. Are you guys keeping up? From Toronto Metropolitan University, and a certificate in adult education from George Brown College. So a teacher literally in his soul across the spectrum. So look at this. He's also been a member of the Canadian Army Reserve since 1991, and between June and December of 2006, he was deployed with the United Nations as an observer to monitor the ceasefire in the disputed Abyei region of southern Sudan. I mean, where's his cape? He's like a superhero. After 7 years of leading a signals regiment in Hamilton, Ontario, he now serves as the senior instructor and acting dean at the Canadian College Command and Staff College in Kingston, Ontario. Who needs a breath? I do. So he's married to Liliana Stanek, a corporate litigator, and has 2 children, Karen and Catriona, who both work and study in Toronto. Holy moly, Christopher Federico. Thank you for being here. I'm so wowed by your many accomplishments and achievements and all the work that you've done in our education systems at all levels. No wonder you know so much. Like every time I talk to you, I'm like, because I think I know some stuff. But when I talk to you, it's like, I did not know that. And I remember the first time that happened was when I was reading a short essay that you wrote. And wow, I got to know this guy. So thank you. Thank you for challenging me, and thank you for being here. Thank you for helping me help others. So let's get into some
You're very
questions.
welcome. Thank you for that awesome introduction. It's always a pleasure when we get a chance to talk. So I'm really happy to be here as well.
And collaborate. Like that's always, we're gonna cook up some interesting work when we collaborate. Always with the heart and with the spirit to help others and to support children, all children in their learning. Okay, so assessment. We've talked about this at length. I know you and I are pretty much aligned in how we feel about assessment, but let's start really simply. What has been the intended purpose of assessment? And let's make sure our viewers know what assessment is. So what is it and what do we want to get out of it for our
Right.
kids'
And
learning?
I think that's a great starting point for a question, because I think there is some distinction between what's the intended purpose or purposes, and then what do we often think about when we think about assessment, right? So I guess maybe to take a step back, because these words get thrown around a lot in education about assessment. And sometimes when we use the word assessment, we equate it with a task. So this is, students will come home and say, I had an assessment today in class. And usually they mean a test or a presentation or some kind of drill or whatever. But assessment is a process that takes place in the mind of the teacher or an assessor, right? So assessment is the process of gathering information and making judgments by the teacher or whoever the other, whatever other assessors they may be, about the quality of student work and learning. That's distinct from evaluation, which is what we think about as teachers and what most people think about when we're actually, now we've gathered that information, we as teachers have made some judgments about it, and now we are like putting a value, hence evaluation, on that, and that value is 10 out of 10 or 92% or B minus or whatever. Yeah. So assessment can have a whole bunch of purposes, but the number one purpose of assessment really should be to improve student learning. Right. So
Bingo.
it's
You have touched on some really critical things there. And I think it gets all tangled up when you talk about the difference between assessment and evaluation. Evaluation, in my mind, involves judgment because we label it with a number or a letter or a level, and that is good or bad, pass or fail.
exactly
Assessment, and I love the fact that you framed it within the context of assessment is in the mind of a teacher, because they're not looking for that letter or that number to say that the child is good or bad. They're looking for evidence of learning.
exactly
So what
right.
parents think about when they think of assessment or evaluation is the test, right? The test. That's all there is, the test. What did I get on the test? How did my child do on the test? Miss, did I pass the test? And so on and so forth. But there are so many other kinds of assessment that educators, as we now have pinpointed that that assessment lies with the educator.
Right.
What are the other forms of assessment that educators can use to come to that point where say the child has achieved, the child is here, and then ultimately, because we still live in this world of evaluation, find that A, B1, level 1, 2, 3, 75, 94, 62. What are the other forms? Because I think there's not a lot of information are out there for parents to understand that teachers are doing much more than just giving a test, or good ones are anyway.
Right. And I think, again, so I start by saying that there's a lot of people who might say, tests are bad and there's no place ever for a test. I don't think that's true. Have a purpose, if they are well constructed, to assess and evaluate a particular kind of learning, a particular kind of knowledge that we may need to do. So there is a time and a place for a well constructed test. So it's not that any one form of assessment, test, essay, presentation, whatever, is bad or good, but they all have their limitations and they all have some advantages. Obviously, having a whole class of students sit down and write a test altogether has the advantage of it being efficient and I guess consistent experience for all of the students if you adjust for accommodations or things like that they need. But it is limited in the kinds of things that you can get information about on which to base your assessment as a teacher from a test. Having said that, and again, going back to this idea that assessment is a process that takes place in the mind of a teacher, anything can be an assessment task. All that you need to provide students is the opportunity to demonstrate to you as a teacher how and what they are learning. So, particularly in the Ontario context, we often talk about triangulation of assessment, or sometimes called, POC, performances, products, observations, and conversations. So the P products are the things like that we have typically thought about as assessment tasks. Test, essay, some kind of science fair project where you've got things up on a cardboard in the gym, that kind of stuff. So those are products, anything a student actually spends time generating. And typically those products, the teacher is the audience directly, right? But teachers can also get all kinds of information and make assessments simply by watching the students do what they naturally do in the classroom, right? Students working in groups, walking around the classroom and seeing a student work on some homework questions that they have been assigned gives you as a teacher insight into that student's thought processes, how well they're working, where they have strengths and where they might need some help. And then another one that's often really overlooked is simply sitting down and having a conversation with the student and asking them some questions about how well they are understanding what they are doing. And it's not, now, I guess you can do a test in an oral format, sit down and have a conversation with a student and tell me, what was the date of this or the causes of World War I or those kind of things. So that is a form of conversation, I guess, but that's really just taking the test and making it oral. But the better conversations are the ones where you actually get to discuss with the student how they're experiencing the learning, what they're struggling with, what they understand about what they are doing. But if students are working on a lab in a science classroom and the teacher is walking around and observing, that's an opportunity for assessment. Anytime that a teacher is in the same place with students and there's an opportunity to gather information, you're doing assessment.
I think, again, I'm not surprised. You just always nail it. And I'm just so thankful that you're here to help us break this down because it's so interesting. So you've touched on the test, which is called formative assessment. And the minute we put the word test for a child with the word assessment, there's a freak out. Even if it's oral, they're going to freak out.
Exactly.
We know that. So we have to deal with that. That's a separate issue. But you also talked about anecdotal assessment, just watching. Like, do parents know that teachers are supposed to be watching for signs of growing, signs of growth and learning, all that good stuff? And then there's varied assessment. So a mark or the value that the teacher comes up with is a combination of all these things. And I'm really trying to shift the focus away from just the test because I'm not sure that a lot of parents out there know that there's all this other stuff going on and I like the fact that you really concretized it and said, the test has its place, but there are these other forms that teachers are also using, or these other types of assessment to come at that evaluation. And students, as well as parents, can have conversations with teachers. How did you get to this? How did you get to this mark? Because ultimately what we want to do is measure student growth and student learning, not the evaluation. So how are students assessed today? I know that in the private system and now flowing over into the public system, there's different ways that students are assessed, and we sort of encapsulated a bit about varied assessment, formal, anecdotal, all that good stuff. But you having this incredible career as an educator, how would you assess a child? Take us through a simple assessment and what that would look like, and the final end mark of what that.
So good question. I think so. To go back to some of these different assessment techniques, I think parents and teachers to some extent still feel like, yes, we can have a conversation and I can observe something, but when it comes down to determining a student's mark or giving them a grade, I need to have a product. So it's going to be a test, it's going to be a final exam. But that and therefore there are certain things that are formative assessment, that is, we gather information for the purpose of giving feedback to the students, and that's not going to be the thing that their mark is based on. Whereas we talk about evaluation or summative assessment, that's got to be a test or a product. That's not really the case. The other thing that I think we've really shifted away from, probably from the time that you and I were in school, is at the start of the year the teacher would give you that handout that said, so here's how you're going to be evaluated this year, and it's like 40% tests, 30% essay, 30% final exam, if my math is right there. But we also know that is very limiting, because certain students will do very, very well on a test and others will not. And how many times have we seen on a report card a comment by a teacher that says something like, although Leah didn't demonstrate it on her tests, in class she showed a command of this skill or expertise in this knowledge. And if that skill or that knowledge is relevant to the course, it's an objective to the course, it's something that is being evaluated at the end, then why does the fact that you demonstrated it in the classroom, or other than on the test that the teacher predetermined was the only way to do it, does that make it any less valid? So if you ask me, how do I think about, and I think luckily the way lots of teachers now are starting to think about is not how much do I measure by tests, how much do essays count for, but to start from the objectives or the outcomes or the expectations of the course, and those words are all kind of used interchangeably, say, what is it at the end of this course students need to be able to do, and what is it that they need to know? So if there's if the expectation is can explain something, then there are innumerable ways that a student can explain it. And I don't need to decide as a teacher up front the one and only way that I'm going to allow students to explain this concept. I'm going to leave that open. Now, I might offer some choice, because in the practicalities of the classroom, it can't be anything goes anytime. But what I need to be sure of is in my assessment plan that I've given that student an opportunity to show to me that they can explain this idea. And that might be on a test they write. It might be on a conversation that we have in the classroom. It might be on a presentation they give. It might be simply as I observe them working on a lab. So the plan of assessment really is, what are the things that I need to be sure that I've got evidence of? Mm-hmm. In my grade book, teachers and parents would often look at it and say, well, what are all these blanks? Because I'd have a column for a test and maybe 5 or 6 students had taken that test. And then I have a column for a presentation and maybe another different half dozen students had done that presentation. I said, well, no one student has to do every single one of these tasks, but I know that there's a through line that no student can, they've got to do at least 1 or 2 of them in this unit. And by doing the test or writing the paper or giving the presentation or coming in to have a conversation with me, they will have demonstrated the ability to explain concept X. And that's the evidence that I need to have at the end of the unit or the semester or the course.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. And this, again, I'm learning this, so thank you. The notion that learning has to have a product attached to it. And that we can get into another discussion, you and I, about politics and economics and political theory and all this good stuff. How do we measure thinking? As we're moving away from a capitalistic, we got to create these widgets and that's valued, to thinking critically. And what are you doing with what you think, and how are you concretizing that?
Right.
That's what we're trying to get. That's tough to show to parents, or tough to, how do you measure that? I mean, these are the global competencies, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about the global competencies. How do we assess that? And what are the limitations to assessing that? Because it's very nebulous.
Yeah, it is for sure. So if we think about, like the global competencies, the way I think about it is the way the Asia Society describes them, investigate the world, recognize perspectives, communicate ideas, and take action. Mm-hmm. You're right. So can you give a student a test on investigate the world, or have them write an essay on tell me how you investigated the world today? Now, of course, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but there is that limitation. What if students are going to investigate the world? That is a process, and you have to observe them engaging in that process. And I think the first step, and this is an exercise that I've taken my own teachers through at a few different schools, is if we say one of the competencies or one of the outcomes we're looking for is that we have students who investigate the world, then we need to break that down and say, what are the behaviors? What does someone who investigates the world actually do? And what would we see students doing in the classroom if they were the kind of student who is investigating the world, right? Are they doing, does research from credible sources, evaluates the sources that they are. So we break all of those things down into a bunch of tasks that teachers can observe. And again, you can observe them a bunch of different ways. So if you're having students write an essay that's the output of an investigation, and you want to see evidence that they have critically analyzed their sources, then maybe that's in an annotated bibliography, or that's in the way that they have thought critically about that source in the context of the presentation they're giving or the book review they're writing or whatever those things are. But again, if we reduce all of those things just to a product, then what you don't get to see is the student's thought process. And it's also, as we start thinking about what is the role of AI and other assistive technologies in this, we all like, how do we know, or how do we, like, if a student has plagiarized the essay? Well, part of it is if all we ask the student to do is to hand in their paper at the end, and the only evidence of learning that we have to go by is what's in the paper, then we're going to have a harder and harder time knowing what's the student work and what is not. But we're also kind of creating an incentive for the student to use AI just because all we're valuing is the product. Whereas if we have the students work on that assignment, come and talk to me about it, go through iterative drafts, and what I actually value is the students' thinking and process of doing the investigation, then the AI has a role and it can reduce some of that grunt work that's not really valuable in student learning, but it's freeing up student time, working memory, a whole bunch of other things to actually do the things that we do value, which is doing the investigation. And that's not really any different from spell check or pocket calculators or a slide rule, right? These are shortcuts to some of the simpler tasks that students have so they can focus, because we all have limited working memory and attention span, focused on the higher order things. Now, that's not to say that having that base of knowledge doesn't matter. Like, there are things you need to know because you can't think critically unless you got something to think critically about. And having to go back and pull out your slide rule or ask a question to your phone every time you want to think about something is also not going to work, right? But there are times where what we really want to focus on are the processes and the student thought, and not these more basic things. And so let's take advantage of the technologies we have and put them to work for us with students. And then when we come to assess and evaluate the student learning, what we want to be doing is how they have used them, not the piece of paper that landed on my desk.
Okay, I think we're done. No, I'm kidding. We're not. But you just encapsulated so beautifully.
Yeah.
Again, we're always just on the same page. And when we're not, you get me to think, which I love. You just nailed it. So if we stop looking as parents for that piece of paper that comes home and says your child got 10 out of 10 because they can spell these 10 words correctly, which is the way we were taught, and which is a lot of parents are still expecting because they haven't seen what's net new. Right. And we stop looking for a product and stop assessing a product that becomes evaluation and start looking at behaviors.
Right.
You called it as soon as you said behavior, I had that ding, 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 ding that I usually get when we talk. I'm like, oh my God, there it is. Like, even though I may understand it some ethereally in my head, you're able to put it in such language that's clear, concise, and easy to understand. So it's not about a 10 out of 10, which is a piece of paper product. It's about what is the behavior that child used or incorporated to get that 10 out of 10 that we're looking at as teachers. I think that is so fascinating and then how we use that just flowed in so beautifully with everybody's talking about AI, how we can use AI to help us with it's part of a behavior.
Exactly.
How did I use that AI to get that 10 out of 10? That is an incredible package. That to me is innovative and wow. I'm just like, I think we can do this. If we could shift towards and if we start to think not only the behaviors about learning, okay, I am learning, I now understand this because based on this behavior, and then I can repeat those behaviors in life to help me with any problem. So those are the learning behaviors, but also behaviors about how to be a good person, how to be a good citizen. What are those behaviors?
Yeah. And so that's interesting because there is a lot of debate, and it's even going on here as I'm doing work on assessment with my own faculty about what should be included in the mark, right? And again, there's a lot of, there's a movement to say, well, do we do away with marks or grades? I don't know if that actually solves the underlying problem, because marks and grades are a symbol that's meant to try and summarize a whole bunch of complicated information. So whether you say that's an A or that's a 96% or that's just excellent work, you're in the end, you're trying to encapsulate something with a relative, like one word, a symbol, a number, whatever. That's what's important is to be clear to, well, for the teachers to be clear in their own minds, and then to be clear with students and parents about what is being counted in determining that when I say you're an excellent math student, well, does my assessment of an excellent math student include how polite you are in the classroom, whether you're organized or not? And those behaviors matter, but whether or not they go in the calculation, or I prefer determination, because we should be moving away from simply putting a bunch of numbers into a spreadsheet and having them grind out the student's grade at the end. That it's being clear being clear about what is being valued. Because again, if our goal of assessment is ultimately about improving student learning, there's very little information that I get as a learner from being told, you got 95 on this essay. Well, because then it usually becomes, well, where did I lose the 5 marks, as opposed to talking about what I did well that I need to be able to repeat, and where I have opportunities to improve that I need to do differently next time. There's actually an interesting study that was done a few years ago and that I think replicated since by Ruth Butler, where she did a little bit of an experiment and took a cohort of students, divided them in 3, and had them all do the same task. And then at the end of doing that task, gave 1/3 of the group just a grade on that task, and 1/3 of the group just feedback on that task, and the final third of the group both the grade and feedback. And then they had the students essentially redo the task, having received that feedback. And the students who only got a grade didn't improve.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, because they really didn't have any information other than somebody's judgment of how well they did the last time. The students who got the feedback about concrete feedback about what they had done well and where there were opportunities to improve, there was significant improvement the second time they did that task. The interesting part was that the third group, the one that got both a mark and feedback, didn't improve. They did about as well as the ones who only got the mark. And so what we know is that people attach value, often disproportionate value, to that symbol. And once they see the symbol, once they see the mark, they really stop paying attention to the feedback. And that's not to say that at some point we don't have to attach value to student learning. Universities need to make decisions about who they're going to admit to what programs. We've got to communicate to parents how well, I guess, their child is doing. But whether that's a word or a letter grade or a number, whatever. But the longer we can hold off putting a value, putting that symbol on it, the more likely we are going to get better student learning and student outcomes, if the feedback that teachers are giving based on their assessment is of high quality and it's actionable and the students can do something with it. Because saying great work is really a grade, it's not feedback.
Okay, if I could drop my mic, I would do that right now. Again, I totally agree. We are in this, I mean, you know my thoughts. I wish we didn't have to have assessment. I wish it could just be like, oh, you got this, great. Oh, you didn't get it, great. Let's what do you need to do? And I would say,
even coming to that conclusion, saying you've got this, is a form of assessment, right? But I think that's what we want to get to, that where the students understand where they need to be, like what is the standard they need to meet, and in what ways they are achieving it, and in what ways they still need to develop in order to achieve it better, right? And when oftentimes we talk about the role of assessment, it really comes down to we're us arguing about marks rather than talking about, again, why we value assessment, which is to improve the student learning. And also, it also provides feedback to the teacher, because if I see, and this used to happen to me as a teacher, I would give a task on something, maybe it was a test or whatever, and I see all of the students, or a large number of students in my class, have done poorly on this one question on price elasticity of demand in my economics class. And then I have to stop and think, well, either the question on the test was bad. It was confusing. The numbers weren't awkward or was missing the point of what I was trying to assess. Or somehow along the line, I didn't teach that concept very well. And my assessment process has illuminated that for me, which tells me I need to do something different as well.
I'm so glad you said that because that's what I've always said that. What have I done wrong? Not why the kids don't understand. What have I done wrong? Because obviously I'm not teaching it correctly, but that's detracting a little bit. But I'm glad you said it because what I want to get into, I mean, you talked about we do have to assess. I agree, we do. It's everything that we've layered on to what assessment means and the judgment and the self-worth. That's what's got to come off of assessment. The judge, like all that icky stuff.
Well, that right, like that having students and unfortunately parents sometimes connect the students' value with the grade they're receiving.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah,
Which is horrible for a child's self-esteem and their sense of self and their ability to learn, grow, and feel good about themselves. We know that. So that's another thing we want to help parents get away from is defining your child's worth or your child's idea of your love for them based on a mark, which is just so destructive and for a child and for a child's development. So that's why assessment, I think, is so sticky for me because I don't want children to hurt. Right. But I want to get back to something. So we talked about there's got to be some sort of, okay, you got this, you didn't. And that's a form of assessment. So thank you. That I've never looked at it that way. So again, I had one of those Federico nuggets of gold. That is assessment, but without all the ickiness attached to it. What if, and I love, because assessment puts teachers in a position of power.
Yeah.
You are assessing my child. And there's got to be ethical considerations around that. And what if we took that power and it became at the beginning of the year, well, student A, what would you like to learn? And where do you want to be by the end of the year? And this is where we'd like you to be. And then the teacher works with that student to play with that power paradigm. And that's just me musing right now. I'm going to take that away. But let's get back to what are the ethical considerations a teacher should consider when assessing a student, and how do they keep their own biases in check? Because we know it's random. And that's why it's really great for parents to have, and I know we're going into progress report time. So to parents to be able to say, and you said it, and forgive me if I'm not getting this properly, what are the elements that went into that assessment so they understand how it was assessed? That's really important in terms of a parent conversation with a teacher when you're looking at a number, letter, grade, whatever. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that there are a few things, and it's interesting because I just read a study that came out. It was done by some researchers at the University of Michigan, where they looked at, because more and more assignments, particularly in post-secondary, but I think it has just the same implications for K to 12 education, like more and more stuff is being submitted online via an LMS, right? So if I've got a whole bunch of students submit some assignment, then the LMS is going to organize it by alphabetical order, and I'm going to grade these things in alphabetical order. Well, what they found, and it actually doesn't surprise me, and it's something that was that students whose names were at the end of the alphabet consistently got worse marks than students who were at the front of the alphabet, because teachers were always marking in a certain order, and they either decided always too generous, or they got frustrated, or they got tired or whatever at the end. And so even things as simple as that, like it doesn't have to be malice on the point of the teacher, that can sometimes skew the way marks are allocated. So there are some very simple things. I think the very first one is exactly the one you pointed out, though, and that's being transparent with students and then with parents about what is the evidence that I am looking for in this particular assessment task, or what is the, like we talked about with the global competencies, what is it that I need to see to be able to convince me that this student has learned this concept or is demonstrating this behavior, and then how will I judge the quality of that? And that might be the frequency that I see this behavior occurring. It might be how many times I as a teacher have to intervene in it. It might be, if it is in fact a spelling test that we are assessing, it might have to do with the number of words that are spelled correctly. But all of those things have to be given up front. And the students and the parents need to be able to ask questions about them. But really, if I've done my job as a teacher properly and I've given the assessment criteria up front to the student, and the students can translate those out of teacher speak into what students understand, then it should be fairly easy for the student or their parent to take what the student did and put it next to the rubric or the list of assessment criteria or whatever that I've given them and say, yes, I see what the teacher was talking about here. My sentences don't end with periods. I've got order of operations wrong on my math tests. I wasn't able to be heard by my peers at the back of the classroom giving this presentation. And so those are the things that need to be really, really clear in how we assess things. And that is true no matter what it is that we are assessing. It's sometimes, again, we go back to the test example. We think that how you get marked on a test is kind of self-evident. Well, it's not really, and it's no more objective than any of these other kinds of assessment tasks. It's just that I, as the teacher, have put my subjectivity into the test at the start because I was the one who made the choices about what questions to ask and how the marks were going to be allocated. But I don't know if I'd asked a different set of questions, would I have got different results from my students? It's kind of like, here we're in this, particularly here in the United States, we're in the middle of the election and there's polls after polls after polls coming out. And, but what's the margin of error of this assessment task that I've given? And that is baked in and hardly ever questioned when we give a test, right? And so we need to say, this test is, or this question on this test is out of 5. Well, where are the 5 marks coming from if that's how we're doing it?
Thank you. Thank you. That is so critical for parents to understand and for parents to know that they can have this discussion at report card time or any time. With good teachers are always open to these discussions. What are you looking for? And then extend that to, how can I support that at home? What does my child need to do? And then, of course, you have to have the child as part of this discussion as well. How are you feeling about this? What do you want to learn? What do you want to do? Where are you stuck? What do you need? All these things really reframe just that product.
Right. And the other thing is to ask some questions. And this is something that again, I work really hard with my own faculty and with others where I'm doing professional learning, is to try and be very clear about what it is that we do need to assess and to try and weed out stuff that is irrelevant, right? So I'll give you one example. You probably remember a task like this from maybe middle school where we're studying or early high school. We're studying some historical period and you're asked to write a journal in the mind of in the voice of some character from
Ava Braun. I did Ava Braun.
There you go.
That.
and then there's like, well, did you make your assignment look old, right? Like, and we'd have students who would be spending time staining their pages with tea to make it look old or singeing it because it looked like it survived a fire or something like that. And those things, I guess there's some creativity involved there. Mm-hmm. But whether or not you spent time staining the pages of your essay, like what course outcome, what learning outcome was that connected to? But we would have teachers who would say, well, this paper you handed in doesn't look old, and therefore you're not getting full marks on it or whatever. And I think we are past that, and maybe that, again, that's a clumsy example, but there are lots of examples where we allow things to creep in to our own assessment practices as teachers. We're making judgments about things that aren't relevant to the particular outcome that we're measuring right now.
So teachers also have to be very mindful and really assess with intent.
Absolutely.
And check themselves. So it's a good practice for a teacher to check themselves when they are assessing in order, and to be very aware that there is a certain element of power if they're not doing it properly. And because sometimes teachers like that. And then that's part of their learning, perhaps, that's something they have to understand and learn about themselves, because it's so delicate when you're teaching children and it's part of your own learning, which is why I'm a big supporter of bring the child into his or their own learning as much as possible. So what do you think can happen, or what happens when students become involved in their own assessment process? Have you ever done anything like that, or
Yeah, so I mean, what I know from my own experience, and what the evidence is very clear on, is that the more you can bring the students in to understand what the performance objectives are that they need to meet, translate those learning goals into, and the assessment criteria into language that the students understand, give them give them right give them the opportunity to practice before you are giving them the final evaluation of whatever that skill or knowledge is. That leads to better outcomes for students. And it's not about inflating marks. It's about helping students find, like, do the right things to demonstrate their learning. Now, there was a time, when we talked about students being involved in assessment or evaluation where, the student A would be up in the front of the classroom doing a presentation, and we'd hand out evaluation forms to their peers. And that has a place, right? So again, if we're very, very clear, we're able to give the other students in the audience, a rubric and say, give feedback to your peer on some of the following things. Could they be heard? Were their visuals big enough? How easy was it to follow? And that is feedback that the presenting student is able to take and process and maybe do better next time. That's fine. What we should not be asking students to do is mark their peers. One, because they're not trained assessors in the way that teachers are, but also it's setting them up, right? Because no student wants to be the one to give their peer a bad mark or any of those kind of things. It's just not fair, right? So students can give feedback to their peers about a whole bunch of things, but in the end, determining the grade that's got to go on that assignment is the role of the teacher. Similarly, the students, we should be training them to be able to do their own self-assessment. Not, I'm going to give myself a mark, but as I look at the work that I have done and I compare it to what I was expected to do, and the teachers being very transparent and upfront about what the expectations were, I should be able to take my work, compare it to the expectations, and come pretty close to giving it the mark that the teacher would have given it, or even if it's not being marked, be able to look at it and say, my first paragraph doesn't have a topic sentence. And I look at my paragraph and I look at what it says in the rubric about what every paragraph should have, and that's feedback to me, right? And that, again, that matters if the students are brought into the assessment process from the very beginning.
I think that's awesome, because then it becomes less about terror and I'm
Yeah.
bad, to your own accountability. And what did I do with the right? And nobody can
Right.
say anything if you haven't put in the work.
Right. And I mean, one of the most frustrating questions you can ever get as a teacher is when that student comes back to you with their test or the essay or whatever and say, again, as I said, what did I do wrong, or where did I lose the marks? And the answer, now, sometimes that's just because students look at the mark and they don't go back and look at the feedback. And if it's there, then you lead them to it. But if it's not, then you've missed an opportunity as a teacher, because it should be really clear to the student, not where they lost marks, because I think that's the wrong framework, but to understand how you assessed and then evaluated the work there based on the look fors that should have been upfront to everybody.
Okay, this entire segment of how to talk to teachers, teacher talk, is going to be of me nodding. Let's just get that out there. It's just catching myself going, okay, I'm nodding again. So I'm just agreeing with everything he says, guys. And I knew I would, but that's not the point here. I want to know, please, Mr. Christopher Federico, what your vision for assessment is and what it can be. How do we get better at this? Because we've talked about teacher accountability, student accountability, parent accountability, and we're in this really weird spot where we still need these grades to figure out if they're going to go to here or there or wherever. We're not quite at the point where it's just like, oh, the joy of learning. I mean, that's my utopia, right? Let's just learn and let's make it wonderful and let's make it joyful. But it's not unicorns and rainbows just yet. So, what is your vision for assessment? How do we do this properly at this point, at this stage in the game?
I think it's really wrapping up all the things that we've been talking about this morning or this afternoon is the to get teachers to be thoughtful at the start as they're planning instruction to do this backward design process. What is it that I need to see? What is it that students need to demonstrate if I'm going to be able to say, yes, they have learned this skill or developed this knowledge or this disposition, that I need to see them at the end, and develop a range of tasks that students can do in the classroom. And that can include products, right? And we're not throwing out the products, but to be able to say again, like, I have a complete view of my student based on being with them over this period of time. And it's about some stuff they've given me. It's about some conversations we've had. It's about some opportunities for me to observe them. And so much of that comes down to having relationships with the students in your class, having connections with the students in your class. So you know that although this student isn't demonstrating this thing on a test, that there's an opportunity for them to demonstrate it somewhere else. And again, it's not about inflating marks, and it's not about not holding students to standards, right? Like, you need to be, as a teacher, you need in the end to be able to say to students and parents, no, you haven't understood this concept properly, or you can't perform this skill yet. And before you're able to move on, you have to master this. So we need to go back and work on that. But it needs to be based on a thoughtful, accurate assessment of the student performing that skill enough times that they've been given the opportunity to really demonstrate it. And I think that's another piece of assessment that, there's a whole debate about how often do you let a student, how many opportunities do you give a student to show you that they've learned this thing? What do you do about work that's late and evidence that's missing? But all of those questions can really be answered when you say, well, the goal of assessment is for me to improve student learning, and the goal of the summative or the evaluation at the end is for me to be able to say to a student at the end of a period of learning, here's how well you've done, and here's where you need to go next. So I think the vision of assessment is really a process where the teacher works with the students, allows them authentically to demonstrate what it is that they need to do in the classroom, and that the teachers are confident to rely on their own judgment based on really clear and transparent criteria to make a decision about the level of the student learning that has occurred relative to the standard, right? And I think that's why we tend to get back to being focused on products and spreadsheets and numerical grades, is that we somehow feel like that is more defensible, right? And that teachers, and that if we were better upfront, more transparent with parents, and brought parents into our thinking, and also educated parents about how to ask teachers these questions, that we would dial down a lot of the angst that everybody has about grading, right? Because that's the other thing that teachers understandably get upset and spend a lot of their time worrying about the argument that they can see coming every time they grade something, right?
Can I drop the mic again? I mean, you just again, this is the intent of what we're doing, you and I. This is the intent of the conversation. This is the intent, is to bring parents into that conversation, arm them with some information, to have respectful, not the argument. We don't want the argument.
Exactly. Right.
Respectful conversations that are rooted in having the information that they need, being able to have ask good questions, and without judgment, without the good and bad, and why isn't my child, and what are you doing, and that antagonism that sometimes happens.
That's right.
We're trying to push away so that we can work together for the best interest of the child.
Yeah, and
So
I mean,
I
and
think that's wonderful.
And when we get fixated on the percentage grade or the letter grade or whatever that thing is, and I know both students and parents will often come in and say, well, that's not fair. My child's mark has gone down, or why did they get this grade, or whatever. And we argue about the number. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the teacher will just say, well, it's not coming off my paycheck, so I'll give you the extra 5% or whatever, if that's what matters. But that's not fair either, right? Because that's just obscuring the learning that the student needs to do and not allowing the student the opportunity to learn. So the more we can focus on the learning and the feedback, even simple things, like I know a lot of schools are changing the order of when report cards go home or what's in a progress report before parent-teacher conferences happen, so that parents are coming in before they've seen a grade mm-hmm. to talk about student learning, rather than coming in as to ask, how come my child's only got a B plus or whatever that thing is. And so I think that's also important, that we can help ourselves in the way that we structure the conversations that we're having with parents and be upfront with parents. We did it here at our back to school night. I got a couple of teachers who are doing some really great things on standards-based grading and spent their time talking to the parents about that, because here's something new you're going to see in my class that you may not have seen before, and you as a parent likely didn't experience in your own lifetime as a student. And so here's what this means when you see it. Here's what this comment is going to mean when you see it on the report card. Here's how that's going to translate into better learning for your child.
That's proactive. That's really great. Yeah. And this, I think maybe that's one of the things we can do as teachers, but also to help our parents show up with a little more, again, with more information and understanding of what's going on in the classroom that is very different from the classrooms that we
absolutely
were taught in. And that's why it's so difficult right now, because parents don't know what's going on in a classroom, have the same expectations as their parents had of them. And we're just preparing kids for a very different world. And there's such a incongruency into what they're looking for and to what we're providing. And there's poor kids in the middle trying to figure it out and be healthy and to have, good habits and be good people. It's a really tough time. So again, the intent of this work is to help, to demystify, to come together, to have these conversations so that we can all be better for our children. I mean, you've answered my last question, which would be, what would be the one thing that parents could take away from this discussion to help them reframe and rethink their children's grades, and how could kids rethink and reframe their grades? I think you've answered it beautifully. Yeah. I love how you took us through evaluation, assessment, product versus thinking, all the strategies that the teachers can use so that their assessment is fair, their own learning, how children can look at their assessments, the information parents can have, how to do that if you're a teacher, to bring a parent in to say, this is what I'm doing. And it is my sincere hope that parents will take us up on all of this, as educators are also learning and shifting, so that their kids can get the best education, get what they need to become the best people they can be on this planet. Absolutely. Basically, we are educating them to be good people, to find their passion in their careers and their life path and all that wonderful stuff. So teachers hold space for something very, very special. And Mr. Federico, I know you do this day in and day out from the many years that I've known you. I'm always impressed by what I learn. I hope that our viewers feel the same. I would be shocked if they didn't. Thank you for your time and your spirit and your ongoing learning and sharing and helping all kids. It's always a pleasure, and I look forward to connecting with you again and continue some of this work together, and excited about what we can do to help our students.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leah. It's been great to join you this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Always a pleasure. Be well, Mr. Federico.
Yes, sir.
Christopher.
Bye.